Well, it's that time again, beginning of October, and every year I pretty much celebrate the month of October by doing 31 days of slashers, which I've done every year for the past 3 years. I pretty much post a movie review for a horror film, usually an entire franchise, every day for a month in October. I actually got the idea from James Rolfe, who produces Cinemassacre.com, and he does one every year called Cinemassacre's Monster Madness, which if you haven't checked out, check it out. He's doing it this year as well. He's been doing it longer than I have. He inspired me to do it, and I just do it for fun. I just love the genre, whether it's good or bad or cheesy or really entertaining. I love horror movies. So if you want to go to my Blip site, blip.tv/LENNSKI0131, you can catch all of my old movie reviews for the past 3 years, covering everything from Friday the 13th to Halloween to Nightmare on Elm Street to the entire Child's Play series. This year I'm doing something a little different because I've been really busy. I didn't have the time to actually do a video because doing a movie review, a 3 or 4 minute video can take hours of work. Usually I prep the videos a few months in advance at least, and I just didn't give myself that much time this year. And in all honesty, I've pretty much covered the broad spectrum of movies that I've seen. Actually, last year I resorted to doing things that weren't movies. I did an episode of Beavis and Butthead. I covered their Halloween episode, Lord of the Harvest, and I also covered the Michael Jackson Thriller video because I was just running out of really good movies to do. I even did a bunch of crappy ones. I did an entire review covering the Howling franchise, for God's sake. So what does that tell you? When you're looking at your DVD collection and you resort to watching the Puppet Master movies, that's when you know that it's probably time to take a little bit of a break. So this year, I'll be doing it in podcast form. I'll try to do these as much as possible throughout October just to share my appreciation for the genre and for Halloween in general. But I'm just going to go over the franchises that I've covered in recent years, just give a little retrospective about the franchises in general. I'm not going to do like one movie every day, but I'll do a franchise every day and try to make it all the way through till the actual day of Halloween. So here we go. Today's first podcast is going to be on the Friday the 13th franchise. So I hope you enjoy, and happy haunting. I went trick-or-treating until I was 18, and at least half of the time, I went dressed up as Jason Voorhees. As a kid, I played the Nintendo game, and in film school, when I directed my thesis project, I played Jason on film. There's a simplistic hook to the character that I can't explain, and an infatuation with these films that's just as indescribable. It's like being drawn into a comic book superhero. A lot of us just love to see Jason kill dumb teenagers. Friday the 13th is a landmark film for me because it set the standard for horror. Growing up, that's what I thought horror was. So when I finally saw classic movies like Psycho and Halloween years later, I was initially unimpressed. I was just like, where's all the blood? Many discount the original Friday the 13th as little more than a Halloween knockoff that got lucky, which it very well could be, except the franchise became so popular that the later Halloween sequels began ripping off of the Friday films. Like most horror movies, I was very young when I got into them. I remember hearing about them in school. One of the kids stayed up late and caught it on cable, then came to school and bragged about how messed up it was. It was one of those things we all talked about, but most of us had never experienced because it was an R-rated movie. That's where my dad came in. My dad believed that the more you censored your kids from something, the more they're going to want to experience whatever it is you're keeping them away from. So what was his solution? Go to the video store and rent them all so I could see them. My dad's a great guy. Not only would I rent them, but I always stayed up late to catch marathons on TNT, HBO, and Showtime. I hated watching them on network TV because the reason you see one of these films is for the kills, which were, excuse the pun, completely massacred. On HBO, they always seem to play parts 1, 2, and 8, so those are the ones that I was most familiar with. At the time, Jason Takes Manhattan was the newest one, so that made sense. One of my earliest memories was watching part 2 during a sleepover. Picture a bunch of horny 8-year-old kids gathered around a small TV, rolling around on the floor as the naked lady pops out of the water. It was exactly like watching Corey Feldman in the final chapter, when he catches a couple about to have sex across from his bedroom window. When we got up to the final act, where Amy Steele's character psychs out Jason to get the best of him, my friend's older sister came into the room and turned off the movie. That was probably what got me into the rest of the series. I didn't want to be censored. I wanted to be able to see these movies, to be that kid that went to school and talked about it with his friends. Fill in the blanks for those who weren't allowed to stay up past their 9 o'clock bedtimes to catch late-night viewings. I also remember every weekend staying up until 2 in the morning having Jason marathons. I always tried to watch the entire series in one go, but I could never stay up long enough. Generally, these movies would come out every year, but when the 8th installment finally came out, they stopped making them until 1993. That was the year that New Line Cinema released Jason Goes to Hell. I was 10 years old, and I was psyched that at long last, a brand new Jason movie was coming out to theaters. I begged my parents to take me, and what did they do? What any decent parent would do. My dad took me and a friend to go see it. To be one of the only 10-year-olds in an audience of adults to experience this movie was profound and exciting. However, it was a little disappointing that the one I finally got to see in theaters was so different from the films I grew up with. In the first 10 minutes of the movie, they blow Jason to smithereens, and the rest of the film, we see Jason's spirit invade human bodies so he can keep killing. It was the origin movie. You've seen those. Every franchise has one. At least every horror franchise has an origin movie that tries to explain what the character truly is. Aside from a lot of sight gags, most of which I just didn't understand at that age, and a ton of brutal violence, as a kid I was really hoping for something a little more traditional. As the years came and went, I grew out of my horror phase and became a devout Star Wars fan, which eventually helped to develop my taste in cinema. With Jason off the radar, I never expected to see another sequel. Then something happened that I can't quite put my finger on. People started to get nostalgic. There were new Star Wars movies coming out, and eventually, throughout the turn of the century, we would see a lot of long-retired movie heroes come back to life. Rocky, Rambo, Indiana Jones, and Jason. When I first heard of Jason X, I was skeptical and appalled. It's been said that space is where a horror franchise goes to die. Cult horror films like Leprechaun and Hellraiser made it to space, and the last thing I wanted to see was the iconic villain I grew up with entering the future. It just seemed too hokey for me. On a lighter note, the fact that Kane Hodder was returning to play Jason kept me interested in seeing it. Jason X was entertaining as a light-hearted science fiction movie, but it ultimately lacked production value, and it seems kind of weird to watch it in October because it doesn't feel appropriate for this season. Then the movie that everyone was waiting for finally came out in 2003. Freddy Krueger was going head-to-head with old hockey face himself. My expectations were soaring through the roof. Since the ending of Jason Goes to Hell, where Freddy's glove reaches up to grab Jason's withered hockey mask, I eagerly anticipated the end-all showdown between my two favorite horror characters. For whatever reason, the project ended up in limbo for the better part of the decade, but that didn't keep me from going to see it as soon as it was released. It's a stupid slasher movie with one hell of a payoff. It pleases fans with several references to both franchises, and while it doesn't get everything right, it really did the best job it could trying to please both sets of fans. The characters are bland, and the dialogue is ridiculous, even for a film in the slasher genre, but the actual fight is well worth the ticket purchase. Then, of course, we had the 2009 remake, helmed by Michael Bay's production company, Platinum Dunes. I'm very open with my opinion about remakes to recent movies in general. The industry seems to thrive on them, and it simply shows a lack of creativity. I haven't looked too fondly at the remake, but at the same time, I don't think I've ever really given it a fair chance. I think one of the main reasons it gets its reputation is because it exists. Friday the 13th didn't need a remake. It was original and shocking for its time, and to this day, it's still very effective. With all of the torture porn films in abundance today, there is nothing you can really do to effectively reinvent the wheel. So how do you approach it? You make it look like a torture porn. That's my biggest beef with the film. Marcus Nispel, the same guy who directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, made it look too much like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. It's way too dark, and they turned Jason into this hulking, macabre villain that chases his prey just like Leatherface. The music and the characters are pretty much identical in both films, and the overall tone isn't that much different either. There is almost an accessibility to the older Jason movies, and while many would argue that Freddy vs. Jason was too campy, and it was, they took the remake in the complete opposite direction. The remake also goes to show just what a picky bunch we are. For years, many of us fans just wanted them to take Jason back to Crystal Lake, and the New Line films did everything in their power to get him as far from home as possible. Then they finally put him back in the woods, and we still complain about it. The Friday the 13th remake is a bit of a departure from the character. He's smarter for one thing, which didn't bother me too much because it actually explains how he can simply appear at will. I also liked how Jason actually took a hostage, and Derek Mears, the actor who played Jason in the remake, did a great job getting that anger across on screen. I think they could have made the kills more elaborate. There wasn't a single death scene that really stood out to me, and the characters again were too stock. You had the slut, the goody-goody, the asshole jock, the token Asian guy, the token black guy. In a franchise where you're really not supposed to put much stock into the human characters, they did a really good job of not making you care in this movie. And the one thing that I'll always dispute is the movie's lame, half-assed ending. It just shows that when you can't come up with a truly creative idea, just do the most predictable thing that comes to mind. In all honesty, the remake is actually a decent nod to the series, and I'm sure with a few more sequels, they could actually come up with a formula that was more appeasing to the fans. As it stands, with Paramount once again taking the reins, the future of the Friday the 13th series is uncertain. I remember wondering as a kid if I would still be watching these movies when I was well into adulthood. While they don't quite have the same impact on me now, I still enjoy marathon sessions during the Halloween season. Whether it's one of the original classics or one of the more recent films, I appreciate the series in its entirety, and I honestly don't think I'll ever tire of them. The fact that I just bought a 7-hour documentary chronicling the making of the entire series is proof of that. The Friday series has never been looked upon fondly by film critics or parents, but for the true fans, there will always be room for Jason in our hearts. Right until he cuts it out of us.